Have you ever noticed this about yourself? You don't reply right away. You feel relieved when plans get canceled. You choose to be alone, not because you're sad, but because it feels right. And if this sounds familiar, people probably assume the same thing about you. That you're lonely, that you're withdrawn, that something must be socially broken inside you. But what if none of that is true? In a world that never stops talking, choosing a solitary life is seen as suspicious. Society equates visibility with health, responsiveness with value, and constant connection with happiness. So when you step back, people don't ask why. They just label you. They call it avoidance. They call it depression. They call it a problem that needs fixing. But here's what they don't see. For many people, solitude isn't withdrawal, it's regulation. Your nervous system reaches its limit faster than others. Too much noise fragments your attention. Too much interaction drains rather than nourishes you. Being alone isn't depressing for you, it's stabilizing. It's where your body finally settles and your thoughts come back into focus. But silence makes others uncomfortable. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't perform belonging. So it gets pathologized. That's why most advice completely misses the point. They tell you to socialize more, push yourself harder, stay visible. But that advice doesn't work because the issue was never a lack of people. It was overload. In this video, we're going to explore the psychology of people who choose solitude, why some nervous systems are wired for quiet, how solitude differs from isolation, and why preferring to be alone is often a sign of self-awareness, not failure. Before we decide that people who choose solitude are broken, let's ask a better question. What if they're not withdrawing from life, but choosing the only way of living that allows them to stay whole? We often talk about being alone as if it's a single experience, as if there's only one emotional state that comes with it. But psychologically, there are two very different realities hiding behind the same word. Loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. They don't even live in the same part of the nervous system. Loneliness is a deficit state. It's what happens when your need for connection goes unmet. There's a reaching quality to it, a quiet hunger that never quite gets fed. You can feel lonely in a crowded room, in a relationship, even while being constantly surrounded by people who claim to love you. Loneliness isn't about physical isolation. It's about emotional absence. And it's exhausting because your system is always searching for something it can't find. Solitude is the opposite. Solitude is not something that happens to you. It's something you consciously enter. When you choose solitude, you're not lacking connection. You're resting from it. Your nervous system isn't scanning for validation or reassurance. It's settling, breathing, reorganizing itself after the demands of the external world. In solitude, you're not waiting to be seen. You're allowing yourself to exist without being evaluated. And that distinction changes everything about how you experience being alone. This is why psychologists have begun using the term aloneliness. It describes the frustration or irritation that arises when someone who needs time alone doesn't get enough of it. For these individuals, constant interaction doesn't feel nourishing. It feels depleting. And without adequate solitude, they don't just feel tired. They feel scattered, unclear, slightly dissolved, as if their sense of self has been diluted by too much external input. This is where language matters more than we realize. Loneliness feels heavy because it pulls you outward towards something missing. Solitude feels grounding because it brings you back inward towards something already present. One drains your energy by reminding you of what you lack. The other restores you by reminding you of what you already possess within yourself. So when someone says they enjoy being alone, they're not saying they don't value people. They're not announcing their superiority or their disdain for human connection. They're saying something much simpler and more profound. They've learned that their relationship with themselves is not a placeholder while waiting for someone else. It's a foundation. And that difference shapes everything about how they move through the world. When people talk about being too quiet or too sensitive to social environments. It's often framed as a personality flaw, as if something needs to be corrected. More confidence would help. More exposure would solve it. More practice would eventually make it easier. But what if the issue isn't personality at all? What if it's physiology? For many people who prefer solitude, the experience of social interaction isn't emotionally painful. It's neurologically expensive. Their nervous systems process stimulation more intensely than average. Conversations require more cognitive bandwidth. Background noise, shifting social cues, maintaining appropriate facial expressions, and constant emotional monitoring all add up faster than they do for others. This is why some people leave a party feeling energized and ready for more, while others leave feeling strangely hollow. Not sad, not offended, not rejected, just depleted, as if something essential has been drained from them that they can't quite name. There's a term that many people recognize instantly once they hear it: social hangover. That foggy, overexposed feeling after too much interaction, difficulty focusing the next day, irritability that seems to come from nowhere, a desire for silence that feels almost physical, like your body is demanding rest after running a marathon nobody else could see. This isn't avoidance, this is recovery. Highly sensitive nervous systems reach their saturation point sooner than others. Once that threshold is crossed, the body shifts from engagement into self-protection mode. Attention narrows, muscles tense. The mind starts pulling inward. Not because it dislikes people, but because it needs to stabilize before it can function properly again. And here's the crucial part that most narratives about introversion completely miss. Needing less stimulation does not mean you need less connection. It means your system requires connection in different doses, at different rhythms. Shorter interactions rather than marathon socializing. Deeper conversations rather than surface-level small talk. Longer recovery periods between social engagements. Quiet time isn't an escape from life. It's the maintenance that allows you to return to life intact. So, before you label yourself as broken, antisocial, or fundamentally defective, consider this possibility. You may not be withdrawing because something is wrong with you. You may be listening to a nervous system that knows exactly what it needs to function at its best. And that listening, that honoring of your own limits, is actually a form of intelligence that deserves respect rather than correction. There's a fascinating idea in evolutionary psychology that helps explain why solitude feels nourishing for some people and draining for others. It's called the savanna theory of happiness, and it suggests that our brains still carry preferences shaped by early human environments. Small groups of familiar faces, predictable rhythms of daily life, tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else. For most people, frequent social interaction aligns perfectly with that ancient wiring. More connection generally equals more satisfaction. The brain rewards tribal belonging because, for most of human history, tribal belonging meant survival. But here's where the research becomes genuinely interesting. Scientists found a consistent exception to this pattern. Individuals with higher cognitive complexity often report lower life satisfaction when they socialize more frequently. Not because they dislike people, not because they're misanthropic or cold, but because their attention is naturally pulled elsewhere, toward ideas, toward long-term projects, toward abstract problems that require uninterrupted focus. Their minds are busy doing a different kind of work, and constant social interaction interferes with that process. Depth changes the equation. When your mind is constantly running simulations, questioning assumptions, building internal models of how the world works, or trying to solve problems that don't have easy answers, casual interaction can feel like friction. Not wrong exactly, just misaligned with what your brain is trying to accomplish. Socializing becomes pleasant but costly. It consumes the mental bandwidth needed for thinking, creating, and integrating complex experiences. This is why so many historically deep thinkers protected their solitude fiercely, not out of arrogance or superiority, out of pure necessity. They understood intuitively what research is now confirming. Their best work required uninterrupted space. But here's the reality check that matters most. Preferring solitude does not automatically mean you're more intelligent than people who enjoy socializing. And intelligence itself isn't a moral badge that makes you better than others. Intelligence shows up in countless forms. Emotional intelligence that reads rooms and navigates relationships with grace, relational intelligence that builds and maintains deep connections, practical intelligence that solves real-world problems efficiently. Analytical intelligence is just one flavor among many. Likewise, many highly intelligent people thrive socially and draw genuine energy from others. They process the world through conversation and collaboration. Their insights emerge from dialogue rather than isolation. There's nothing inferior about that approach. So this isn't about superiority, it's about alignment. Some minds process the world outwardly through constant exchange with others. Other minds process inwardly through synthesis and reflection. Neither approach is objectively better. But confusing one for the other creates unnecessary shame and self-doubt. If socializing leaves you depleted, it doesn't mean you're defective. It doesn't mean you're exceptionally brilliant either. It may simply mean your mind prioritizes depth over frequency, meaning over motion, integration over stimulation. And once you understand that difference clearly, the pressure to perform connection the supposedly right way begins to loosen. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking a much more useful question. What environment allows my mind to function best? That question leads somewhere productive. The other question leads nowhere but shame. At some point in understanding yourself, the word introvert stops being sufficient. It explains where your energy goes, but it doesn't capture how you actually move through the world. It doesn't describe the deeper pattern behind people who are genuinely comfortable standing slightly apart from the crowd. Not out of shyness, not out of fear, out of self-direction. Psychologically, these individuals score high in a trait researchers call autonomy. And autonomy isn't independence in the rugged, antisocial sense that American culture sometimes celebrates. It's something more subtle and more powerful. It's the ability to regulate yourself from the inside, rather than constantly looking outside for guidance. When you have high autonomy, your values aren't borrowed from whatever room you happen to be standing in. Your sense of worth doesn't rise and fall with external approval. When faced with a decision, you look inward before you look around. You check your own compass before consulting the crowd. This changes everything about how you experience social situations. While most people unconsciously scan social environments for cues about how they should behave, what's acceptable here, what will others think, self-directed individuals rely on an internal guidance system. They don't need to perform alignment with the group because they already know where they stand on their own. From the outside, this can look like detachment or arrogance or emotional coldness. People sometimes interpret it as not caring what others think. But internally, something very different is happening. There's a quiet steadiness that doesn't need external validation to feel solid, less urgency to be understood by everyone, less fear of being temporarily misread by people who don't know you well yet. This is also why external validation often feels strangely unsatisfying to highly autonomous people. Praise doesn't land the way it does for others. It's nice, but it doesn't fill anything that was empty. Criticism doesn't devastate them either. They can hear it, evaluate whether it's accurate, and move on without their sense of self collapsing. Their nervous system simply isn't calibrated to constant external feedback as a source of stability. Autonomy reduces psychological noise. It creates space for long-term thinking rather than reactive decision-making. It enables ethical consistency because your principles don't shift based on who's in the room. It builds emotional self-trust because you've learned to rely on your own judgment over time. And because highly autonomous people don't rely on social mirroring to feel real, they can tolerate extended periods of being alone without collapsing into self-doubt or existential anxiety. They're not withdrawing from others out of fear. They're simply anchored in themselves in a way that doesn't require constant external confirmation. Once you understand autonomy as a psychological orientation rather than just a personality label, you stop confusing quiet self-direction with emotional absence or inability to connect. These are not the same thing at all. For many people, small talk is completely harmless. It's a social warm-up, a way to signal friendliness without asking much of anyone, a lubricant that keeps social machinery running smoothly. But for those wired for depth, small talk can feel strangely exhausting, not because it's awkward, because it's empty of meaning. Surface-level conversations demand a particular kind of performance that depth-oriented people find draining. Smiling at precisely the right moments, reacting with just enough interest to seem engaged, tracking social cues that don't actually matter to anything you care about. Your mind is busy, but it's not engaged in anything meaningful. You're physically present, yet internally drifting somewhere else entirely. Over time, this pattern creates a quiet fatigue that's genuinely hard to explain to people who experience social ease naturally. It's not that the conversation was difficult or unpleasant. It's that it cost something without providing anything in return, like paying full price for an empty box. This is why silence often feels preferable to forced conversation. It's not that depth-oriented people dislike talking to others. They dislike friction without substance. They're drawn to exchanges that actually move somewhere interesting. Questions that open up new territories rather than just filling empty space with noise. Conversations about ideas, inner worlds, contradictions, genuine struggles, and honest truths. When that depth isn't available, remaining silent often feels more honest than pretending to be interested in something you're not. There's also the hidden cost of social masking. In small talk situations, many people unconsciously wear a simplified social version of themselves, lighter, easier, less complex than they actually are. For someone whose inner world runs deep, wearing that mask constantly can feel like a slow erasure. Each shallow interaction files down a little more of who you actually are. Not dramatically, just steadily. And the cumulative effect is exhausting in ways that don't show up on any obvious metric. So, choosing silence isn't rejection of other people, it's self-preservation. It's the conscious decision to save limited energy for moments that actually matter, for conversations that nourish rather than deplete, for connections that honor your full complexity, rather than requiring you to shrink yourself for easy consumption. Once you recognize that deep hunger for substance, you stop mistaking selective engagement for social failure. It was never about being antisocial or unfriendly. It was about being sincere in a world that often rewards performance over authenticity. When solitude is genuinely chosen rather than forced by circumstance, it becomes more than just rest. It becomes an incubator for everything that matters most to you. In quiet, something subtle but essential happens inside the mind. Your attention stops fragmenting across dozens of competing demands. The constant background task of monitoring others disappears entirely. There's no one to impress, no social rhythm to match, no emotional weather to track in someone else's face. And in that absence of external demand, the mind finally has room to organize itself properly, This is why solitude has always been linked to creativity and genuine insight. Without constant interruption, thoughts are allowed to unfold fully to their natural conclusions. Ideas can connect across time instead of being cut short by the next notification or social obligation. Emotions that were postponed during busy social periods can finally surface, be felt completely, and then be integrated into your understanding of yourself. Solitude gives the psyche a chance to actually metabolize experience, rather than just constantly reacting to whatever comes next. Neurologically, this inward-focused state activates an entirely different reward system than social interaction does. Instead of the high arousal stimulation that comes from novelty and social feedback, the brain releases neurochemicals associated with focus, calm engagement, and sustained attention. This is the neurological foundation of what researchers call the flow state. That immersive experience where time seems to soften and effort feels almost invisible, where hours pass like minutes and you emerge feeling more energized than when you started. But it's important to be completely clear about something. Solitude doesn't create brilliance or creativity on its own. Nobody becomes insightful simply by sitting alone in a room. What solitude creates is conditions. Conditions where curiosity can deepen naturally, where half-formed ideas aren't rushed prematurely into performance for others, where self-expression doesn't need an audience to feel real and valid. For some people, this is where their most honest work is born. Not because they've isolated themselves from the world, but because they've finally created enough quiet to hear what they actually think and feel. Solitude, practiced well, isn't an escape from life. It's where life is quietly assembled, piece by piece, before being carried back out into the world with clarity and intention. The solitary time isn't separate from your real life. It's where your real life gets built. Everything we've discussed so far paints solitude in a positive light, and for many people, it genuinely is positive. But intellectual honesty requires acknowledging something more complicated. Solitude can be a sanctuary, but it can also become armor. And the difference between those two states is subtle enough that you might not notice when one transforms into the other. Healthy solitude is actively chosen. It restores you measurably, it sharpens your sense of self, and sends you back into the world feeling more grounded than before you withdrew. That's the ideal. That's what solitude is supposed to do. But there's a moment when solitude stops being about nourishment and starts being about protection. Not protection from noise or overstimulation, but protection from risk. Protection from the possibility of being hurt again. This is where the psychological trap begins. When being alone is no longer about finding peace, but about avoiding disappointment before it can happen. When silence isn't restful anymore, but rigid and defensive. When the thought of genuine connection doesn't feel neutral or even curious, but actively threatening. At that point, solitude has quietly transformed into something else entirely. It's become a wall rather than a refuge. Often this shift isn't conscious at all. It forms slowly after being misunderstood too many times. After having your words twisted by people who didn't bother to listen carefully. After having your emotional depth dismissed as overthinking or drama. After having your clearly stated boundaries crossed by people who claimed to care about you. After enough of these experiences accumulate, withdrawal starts to feel safer than engagement. And over time, the nervous system learns a dangerous and incorrect lesson. It learns that distance equals safety in all situations. That isolation protects you from pain. This is not healthy solitude anymore. This is hiding. And the difference matters enormously for your well-being. The warning signs of this shift aren't dramatic or obvious. They're quiet and easy to miss. A growing bitterness toward people in general that wasn't there before. A shrinking emotional range where you feel less of everything, good and bad. Neglecting basic self-care because it doesn't seem to matter anymore. Losing interest in being known by anyone at all. A sense that connection is no longer worth the inevitable cost it carries. When isolation starts to harden you instead of soften you, when it makes you more defensive rather than more grounded, it's no longer serving its original purpose. Even the most self-directed people genuinely need contact. Not constant connection that exhausts them, real connection. A few trusted relationships where you don't have to perform a simplified version of yourself or constantly explain your unusual wiring to skeptical audiences. The healthiest solitary individuals aren't those who successfully avoid the world entirely. They're the ones who have learned when to step back and when to step forward. They can walk into social situations when needed and leave without resentment when they're done. Solitude should be a place you visit intentionally, not a place you disappear into and never return from. And recognizing that difference before it's too late is an act of self-respect, not weakness. It takes more courage to maintain connection when you've been hurt than it does to withdraw entirely. Both paths involve pain. Only one leads somewhere worth going. So how do you practice solitude in a way that actually serves you? Healthy solitude isn't about cutting yourself off from the world entirely. It's about consciously choosing how and when you engage with it. For people who genuinely thrive in quiet, the goal isn't permanent isolation. It's sustainable balance. A rhythm that honors your deep need for quiet without sacrificing human connection entirely. A pattern you can maintain for years without burning out or drifting into unhealthy withdrawal. This often means having fewer relationships, but investing more deeply in the ones you keep. Less frequency of contact, but more intention behind each interaction. Quality, rather than quantity, applied to your entire social life. At its healthiest, solitude operates in cycles rather than as a permanent state. You step back when you need to restore your nervous system. You reflect, think, create, process experiences, and recalibrate your internal compass. Then, when your energy returns naturally, you step forward again. Not to perform social normalcy for others, but to genuinely participate in life. To connect in ways that feel aligned with who you actually are, rather than obligatory and draining. This is where the concept of a small, safe circle becomes essential. Most depth-oriented people don't need many connections to feel fulfilled. They need a few relationships that are genuinely honest and emotionally regulated. Relationships where your silence isn't automatically misread as anger or rejection. Where taking space doesn't trigger abandonment fears in the other person. Where you can disappear for a while to recharge and return without needing to explain yourself or face punishment for your absence. Healthy solitude also requires developing one genuinely uncomfortable skill. The skill of noticing when your withdrawal has gone too far. When you've crossed from restoration into avoidance. When quiet has become numbness rather than peace. If you find yourself feeling increasingly numb instead of calm, if connection starts feeling not just tiring, but genuinely impossible, if solitude no longer restores you, but leaves you feeling emptier than before, it's time to gently reopen the door. Not to everyone, not to people who have proven themselves unsafe, just to what's actually safe and nourishing. The strongest, most sustainable form of solitude doesn't reject humanity. It refines your relationship to it. You're not hiding from the world out of fear. You're learning how to enter it without losing yourself in the process. And when solitude is practiced this carefully and this intentionally, it doesn't make you smaller or more isolated. It gives you something genuinely rare, the ability to be fully alone and genuinely connected without betraying either state. The capacity to move fluidly between solitude and connection as your actual needs require, rather than being trapped permanently in either extreme. There's a quiet kind of strength that rarely gets celebrated in our culture. Not the strength of being constantly seen, not the strength of being widely admired or universally popular, but the strength of being genuinely at ease in your own presence, of not needing external stimulation to feel real and alive. When you become truly comfortable alone, something fundamental shifts in how you experience everything. You stop chasing noise just to avoid the silence within yourself. You stop measuring your worth by how quickly others respond to your messages, approve of your choices, or include you in their plans. Your sense of stability stops living outside of you in other people's reactions and moves to its proper home inside your own experience. This transformation doesn't make you superior to people who draw energy from constant connection. It doesn't make you enlightened or spiritually advanced. It makes you self-trusting. And self-trust changes everything about how you relate to others. Being genuinely at peace with solitude means you can choose connection rather than cling to it desperately. You can walk into relationships without unconsciously needing them to complete you, fix your broken places, or rescue you from the difficulty of being alone with yourself. And because of that fundamental security, your connections with others become cleaner, calmer, and more honest. You're not performing intimacy while secretly terrified of abandonment. You're not people-pleasing to earn love you don't believe you deserve. You're simply present, offering what you actually have to give. In a world that constantly demands your attention, choosing quiet is a form of freedom. It's a refusal to let your nervous system be permanently hijacked by endless stimulation. A decision to move at a rhythm that actually belongs to you rather than one imposed by algorithms and social expectations. Not everyone needs to make this choice, but for those who do, for those who feel the pull toward depth and silence and reflection, honoring that pull is not withdrawal from life, it's the foundation that makes a meaningful life possible. If this video put words to something you've always felt but never quite knew how to explain, you're not alone in this. This space exists for people who experience the world deeply, quietly, and thoughtfully. People who have been told their whole lives that something is wrong with them for not wanting what everyone else seems to want. People who have wondered if they're broken simply because they need more silence than noise, more depth than surface, more meaning than motion. You're not broken. You're wired for depth. And that wiring, properly understood and honored, is not a flaw to be corrected. It's a capacity to be cultivated. The question was never, how do I become normal? The question is, how do I build a life that lets me be fully myself? And that question has an answer. It requires understanding your own nervous system with compassion rather than judgment. It requires building a small circle of people who can accept you as you actually are. It requires practicing solitude intentionally rather than using it as a place to hide from life. And it requires trusting that your relationship with yourself is not a placeholder. It's the foundation everything else gets built on. What does solitude give you that the world doesn't?